Well, I'm thrilled to introduce Matty Steiner, who works at Compass Education Group and has over a decade of experience in the field of test prep, having worked as an instructor, a consultant, a keynote speaker on the topic of admissions and testing. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Matty. We're going to cover a bunch of topics tonight. We're going to look closely at testing and the ways the tests have changed recently. This is something that I think a lot of parents are looking to learn a great deal about. We're going to talk about how students can think about submitting scores with so many colleges being test optional, and what students need to know to pick the right test and be prepared to take it. If you have questions, some of you I know have already left us questions, but if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. I will gather them, and when Matty's finished chatting, we will have time to answer some of these questions. So Matty, welcome to Grown and Flown, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa and Helene in the background, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all. I am one of those bizarro, maybe somewhat masochistic people that have decided to make this very niche hobby into my livelihood. And I say that with an additional sense of irony because I myself was an abysmal tester. I know if your students are made anxious, if you perhaps didn't do as well on standardized tests, I feel you, I get you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, by the way, so that way you can see my slides more effectively. Okay, cool. I'm going to go full screen with this. Lisa, is it looking good on your end?
Yep, perfect.
All right, wonderful. So as Lisa was saying, I've actually been in this industry since 2007. I've worn lots of different hats, and my favorite role has been what I've done for the last 11 years at Compass Education Group. Compass is a provider of private tutoring and classroom instruction across the country and around the globe. They do really wonderful work, but I promise tonight is not a thinly veiled sales pitch. It's going to be very much a research-based and hopefully a pragmatic approach to this topic. If you are so inclined, there will be links that will be shared by the team at Grown and Flown, ways to get in touch with me and my colleagues if you'd like to learn more about what we offer service-wise. But my goal tonight is to lay the correct posture and precedent for a topic that I think is often laden for your students with extra meaning and importance. And you know, ideally, as parents with the gift of hindsight, that beyond this narrow window of adolescence, these exams mean very little. That if you brought up an SAT or ACT score at a cocktail party, you would unceremoniously lose all of your friends, right? All right, cool. We're all on the same page. So here's what I'm going to try and cover, but I might need to pick and choose based on both the interest level of the group and the amount of time that we have tonight. So the testing landscape, as Lisa was referring to, is the various policies that colleges now have really, I think, has become far more diverse and interesting since the pandemic, with close to 85, 90%, depending on how you turn the crystal, of colleges adopting some flavor of a test optional policy, a much smaller amount being test required, and those others that are test free. We'll talk about what that means. You have two options, and we'll try and separate this out for both, mostly, I think what's relevant, sophomore and junior families. I am a firm believer that the majority of good work on testing should happen in really no later, no earlier than the summer, let's say between sophomore and junior year, maybe spring of sophomore year. But most students tend to do their best on these assessments after they've been exposed to their cumulative math and reading curricula. So if you're desirous of starting sooner rather than later, know that that can create a protracted testing timeline for your students, and they could potentially burn out. So we'll talk about your options, the SAT or ACT, which have undergone some pretty significant plastic surgery in the last couple of years. More recently, I'll talk about the new ACT or core ACT that debuted just a couple of weeks ago. We'll also review what happened with the new digital adaptive SAT as of spring of 2024. Then I'll give you other best practices for, as I had said, scheduling tests and potential prep. How do you do that effectively? What are the tenets of good preparation, regardless of the modality that you might use? And then in what cases would it behoove you to submit your scores if you are in fact applying to institutions that are test optional, okay? And Lisa, by the way, if at any point you want to interrupt me and come back to something or clarify, please do so.
Thanks.
I will not mind. One of the reasons why you don't need to take copious notes tonight, by the way, is a link that I'll be providing to Lisa and company. We have this handy dandy guide to college admission testing, which lo and behold, it is over 100 pages if I go to our table of contents. No one expects you to read this baby from cover to cover, all right? It's going to vary based on your student's testing trajectory, but it will cover in much greater detail what I'm trying to touch on in a much more broader and streamlined way this evening. So know that this tome will be at your disposal. And even if we don't get to questions that you're interested in tonight, you'll be able to find those answers later, okay? I'm going to jump back into the presentation. Cool. So let's first talk about the testing landscape. Why do these assessments even exist? And why do we have a level of disagreement as to whether or not they should be required? So I think the most clear argument that's made by the makers of college boards, or I should say the SAT, the College Board, and ACT Inc., the maker of the ACT, is that standardized tests are needed to decode the transcript, which has become more and more diluted in recent history. Actually, as early as 2017, you can see here, among students applying to four-year colleges, those 2017 and beyond, the most dominant GPA was a 4.0 or higher, okay? As many as 55, basically, percent of students applying to four-year colleges had some flavor of an all-A average, which makes it very difficult for colleges to parse out meaningful differences in academic readiness, because we understand that rigor doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in all places. That I don't know, a 4.0 at a rigorous independent school in a major metropolitan area versus a 4.0 in rural Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, which is, by the way, where my husband's from. It's the noodling capital of the world, population 7,000. My husband was valedictorian, and though I don't besmirch the great work that he did, I think it's important to know that, yes, maybe that GPA is not necessarily the same thing as a GPA elsewhere. So what standardized tests do then is provide us an even keel for assessing the underlying proficiency in the crude and broad math and verbal content areas that these exams cover. And one of the aphorisms that has stuck with me forever and a day that my colleagues at Compass had taught me is that the SAT and ACT truly are crude assessments of a narrow band of academic skills taken under duress. But it's the duress piece. It's the unfamiliar, the alien nature of the questions themselves. It's how the items are worded and the way in which difficulty is distributed that ensures that regardless of when or where these tests are taken, and regardless of what might be happening culturally around the country around GPA, you see relatively the same distribution of scores. For the ACT, most folks score toward the middle, maybe around a 17 or an 18 across a 36-point scale. On the SAT, same shape essentially, but on a 1,600-point scale. All right. I don't have enough time to cover this in detail tonight, but even though we understand based on the distributions of SAT and ACT scores, what is a more or less common score, what a good score is relative. It hinges on where it is that you're going to be applying with your student. So this is just a sample student that I worked with in the Washington, D.C. area not too long ago. I'm calling her Sally. And she was at a pretty intense DC all-girls Catholic school, was hoping to continue her work at a Jesuits college on the East or the West Coast. Georgetown was number one for her family. And immediately we went to what's actually published in our guide to testing, which are the mid-50th SAT and ACT percentile ranges achieved by matriculating freshmen year over year. So broadly, this is how you can think of what is a score that qualifies me or basically suggests that I'm on par with how students have performed historically, and I can focus on other more important things in my application. I will say that in spite of testing being useful, the transcript and the rigor of that transcript still have ascendant value within the college admissions process. And there have been many colleges, even before the pandemic, that have been test optional for quite a long time that have grown incredibly adept at reviewing applications with or without scores. In fact, they can take them or leave them, right? So this is just an idea, SAT, ACT, but try not to focus too much on these numbers. They are not cut scores. You can still be admitted to even a school that requires the SAT or ACT if you fall below the mid 50th percentile range. So prior to the pandemic, among the 400 plus colleges that we track at Compass, the vast majority were requiring these exams. This is likely what you saw when you were maybe taking an SAT or ACT and applying to college. Nowadays, it's totally inverted. So most folks are in the test optional camp and are either temporarily suspending a requirement and using research to determine whether or not they return to testing, or they've legged into a more permanent policy because they've liked how it served them. In the last year or so, we've seen quite a few colleges on the highly selective end. I use the term highly selective. I feel like it's often conflated as being like better schools. We often cling to the US News and World Report rankings as an example of what constitutes a good and successful college education. And truly, when I'm saying selective, I'm mostly talking about this being a popularity contest, that there are plenty of other schools that will accept your students, but they just are less well known, and these selective schools have this abundance of riches available and interested applicants, but not enough spaces to house them all, right? So to be clear again, test optional means that your application is complete with or without the inclusion of a score. SAT or ACT required means required. And test free if you are originally from the West Coast like me. I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad, go banana slugs, all right? And at that point, they required the SAT and ACT. But now by being free, they've gone ahead and determined that these assessments are less useful in the admissions process. In fact, they're verboten. You cannot submit an SAT or ACT. Although oddly enough, if you're applying to Berkeley, UCLA, or some of the more selective colleges within the University of California system, they are test-free for the SAT and ACT, but not for AP exams. And I'm often hearing students struggling then to take a bunch of APs. Here's just a smattering of some of the schools that are requiring these tests. You'll notice that, again, it's mostly highly selectives across the country. State schools, particularly those in the South and Southeast United States, and then also the service academies, okay? There are others that are coming forward, but I wanted to give you a sense of how rarefied the list is, but how they punch way above their weight and probably why they get the attention of the media and other places. I've also included a couple examples of test optional schools that I think have a very clear preference for these exams. So you want to look a little bit more closely. In this case, we see Rice, which makes it explicit. We therefore are moving to recommend that students submit the testing. No student should be thinking to themselves in applying to Rice in Texas, what is the bare minimum that I can do, right? They're probably thinking, how can I optimize every element of my app, including the testing piece, especially when most of my colleagues, my peers, are applying with scores. I think the biggest kind of, what do I want to say, exasperation I had around testing policies was with Purdue this past fall. I had students that were applying without scores because Purdue was test optional, only to have been notified, my students received this email. Thank you for applying to Purdue, exclamation point. They seem very sweet. As a reminder, Purdue is test expected, which is a term that they just invented on the spot, right? This is not something that's been in existence. So please submit your SAT or ACT scores. This is a clear, I think, example of some institutional doublespeak. Ideally, Purdue should just go the route of requiring these tests and making it clear to students so there isn't, a lack of understanding. All right. To summarize that piece, what I'm going to recommend to you families is that regardless of when it is that you're applying to college, regardless of what's going on in the underlying testing policy landscape, it's going to be a good idea to have a test or two under your belt for your students, so that way they can exercise the choice of applying to a test optional school with a score, or they have the opportunity to apply to schools that might require these assessments. I'd hate, for example, you to after you've fallen in love with a school that is temporarily test optional, only to have revoked that policy and returned to testing. So you can really only exercise test optional if you have the option of submitting scores that you've procured. All right. Cool. So in terms of our options, SAT or ACT, I want to make clear that although they're sort of more regionally popular, the SAT was far more of a thing on the East and the West coasts. I know that's all I knew when I lived in Los Angeles forever and a day. ACT was more popular in the Midwest. Now they're ubiquitously accepted by colleges, and there is not a whiff of preference for one exam or the other. So try and ignore the alpha parent gossip that might be existing at your school. It's a really great idea to have your students sit for full-length practice exams to see if they have an underlying affinity for one test or another, or even if they're not performing significantly higher on one test, it's good to know, I maybe hated this one exam a little bit less than the other. That's totally fine for students to feel that way. Looking at College Board's SAT, the most notable change these days is that it's gone as of spring of 2024, digital and adaptive. So gone are the days on the SAT and PSAT of the tests being on paper, filling in bubbles. You are using a program that you download onto your computer called the Blue Book app. It also runs AP exams, all College Board products. And you bring your laptop or use a device that's furnished for you when you get to a test site. The exam is still on a 1,600-point scale and is divided between math and verbal, just like the test of yore that I had taken. However, it is significantly truncated. What used to be a 3+ hour assessment has turned into 2 hours and change. How did they accomplish that? Well, it was by basically having the test adapt based on how students performed on an initial section, or what they like to call modules. So on the SAT, you begin with an initial math or verbal section, and based on that performance, you are routed to a secondary, either easier or harder module, which brings into focus different parts of the scale out of 1,600. So if you want to achieve some of the more coveted scores, the expectation is that you will have gotten more questions right in the initial module. This is not something that is advertised to students. They're not told as they're completing the assessment whether or not they've landed in the easier or harder path, nor do colleges know, nor should they care, right? This is, I think, confusing how the underlying calculus works, but the way in which students should approach this is just like a paper and pencil exam. Try to get as many questions right as possible. Don't skip anything, okay? And actually, regardless of where you're routed, you could still potentially end up at a score that's the same between two pathways. The available scores are actually like a overlapping Venn diagram, regardless of the route that you go down, okay? Now let's compare that with what I'm calling the classic, or the current version of the ACT that's been on paper since the 1950s. Unlike the SAT, it is 4 sections, all right? We have math, reading, English, and science. Already, your math-phobic students might find that this is enticing because math is only worth 1/4 of your total composite score. It's out of 36 points, but it hasn't reduced in its length, right? It's still about 3 hours and change, right? On top of that, there has been an experimental section with questions that basically ACT is using your students as guinea pigs to see whether or not they perform to spec on those questions and they appear on future assessments. And I beseech thee, ignore the optional essay like the plague. There is only one college in the entire country that cares about the optional essay. Normally, when I ask folks, I'll have them raise their hand and guess what it is. And it's not any of the Ivies. It's not Harvard. In fact, it's Martin Luther College in Minnesota. So I don't know, we might have a bunch of Martin Luther fans here, which is awesome. But I don't think it's enough of a value to go through this torturous 40-minute essay after 3 hours of multiple choice. Okay, so ignore. Here's what writing or reading looks like on this assessment, and compare that, so ACT reading, versus what is now, sorry, yes, everybody probably doesn't like these passages. Leslie Knope is one of my favorite characters of all time, so I like to sprinkle her throughout. Here is a clear differentiation in how reading works on the SAT versus the ACT. So because the assessment has become more abbreviated, they've also reduced the amount of text and reading that you need to do. And upon completion of reading a small passage and one question, the slate is wiped clean and you are given another bite-sized passage to review with a singular question. Uh, College Board, with its new test, has done a great job in creating a test that feels like a lighter lift, but be aware that even if students feel like the PSAT or the SAT is, quote, easier, broadly, students perform commensurately on both exams. It's why they're used interchangeably by colleges. So oftentimes, much of what we're trying to do at Compass is for a student who might prematurely think that the SAT is a better fit, but then we look at the workup of a score report on their ACT practice test, and there is far more potential for improvement. One of the sections that struck fear into the hearts of many students that I had tutored for years was science. But I would often have to do this exposure therapy exercise and show them what was actually on it. And even though it looks technical and scary, it's a continuation of the prior reading section. You don't need any prior bio, chem, physics, or anything to do quite well. Now, what's going on with this new ACT? That seemed fine, right? Couldn't we just have two options that seemed different enough, maybe gave us a subjective sense of what we might prefer? Well, ACT has been failing in the court of public opinion for a little while. College Board, with its new digital adaptive SAT, has gotten a lot of new fans. And ACT has been looking to make some significant changes and pull market share. And one of the first things that they have done in creating a new version of the test that debuted just a couple of weeks ago is by making the science portion of the exam optional. So it's been exiled to Siberia. It gives its own 36-point scale, but it is not a part of the new core composite, which is just English, reading, and math. So that's ultimately going to be the composite that colleges care most about. You see, by removing the science, we actually abbreviate the exam quite a bit. Basically 50 minutes shorter and 44 fewer questions. And some of these sections also have had a little bit of a haircut to make the test more digestible. But it is not an adaptive test. It is still, like the predecessor that included science, requires every student, regardless of their underlying ability, to sit for the same number of easy, medium, and hard questions, okay? What else about science? You might be asking yourselves, well, we just heard that the tests are broadly optional at many colleges. Now we have to determine whether or not to take this science thing. I'm so sorry. I have the greatest empathy for you all. This is where I think there is paralysis due to the amount of flexibility that these policies are attempting to engineer and make clear, but it only creates, I think, more confusion. And colleges have been sort of slow to respond. Testing hasn't been the most exciting thing for them to deal with in the last several years. There's always been changes. So you'll see examples of colleges that thus far, and I'm going to send you a link, or I should say, Grown and Flowing will be sending you links to the resources after tonight, where we have lists of colleges that have shared a stance on what to do with science. So University of Colorado Boulder says, we will not consider the optional science section. Don't worry about it. Whereas also, actually, UGA, the University of Georgia, says that using only English, math, and reading sections, all right? In contrast, this is kind of a gossipy text message that I probably shouldn't even be posting here, but I thought it was too good. We had a mole at UT Austin that we had reached out to, and they had said that science historically has been a valuable part of their academic index. Essentially, when they're determining whether or not to give merit aid to students and they're combining GPA and test scores, science has always been a part of those things. So they're expecting to make that required going forward, right? So it's a pain in the rear. I don't have a clear response, an answer for you regarding what everyone is going to do. It seems like thus far, the safest move among colleges has been to say, we'll make it optional and it's up to students. But that's probably less helpful. In the next year or two, we're telling our families that students should plan to take the ACT science section, almost in the same way we're saying plan to have a test or two to take more broadly, because you don't know where that science section or the test could behoove you, could help you. So don't unintentionally foreclose early by sitting out of a section of a test that is only an additional 30, 40 minutes, okay? All right, let's move forward. Okay, this is by far the worst slide I've ever had to present on. I'm so sorry. This is the overall schedule of the release of these assessments. The core test that I mentioned on the ACT, the new version of the exam that's just English, math, and reading, debuted in April, just a couple of weeks ago. But it was only available to take on test sites that offered it in a computer-based format, all right, that furnished students with computers to take the assessment. What's odd, and you'll notice this if you are currently a junior family, is that students have the opportunity to sit for a paper version of the classic ACT that includes science until July of this year. Once we get to July, all right, when we jump into the new academic year, the core ACT replaces all previous iterations, all right? But oddly enough, ACT has said that they're going to keep both the option of students taking a digital version of their core test or a paper-based version of their core test. Again, more options, while it appears to give flexibility, I think often yields uncertainty, okay? Here's what we're saying overall for families. So juniors, ignore the core ACT. I just want to make that clear. You don't want to be the guinea pigs initially. You can choose between the SAT and the classic paper and pencil test with science, right? You can take practice tests to determine whether or not you like one assessment more than the other. And if you have to take another ACT in fall of your senior year, it's okay if you switch over to the new exam. Generally, what we found is that this hasn't been like a scorched earth overhaul of the ACT. All they've done is some sort of sensible nipping and tucking to make it more attractive to students, really making it shorter. But all of the underlying content on the new ACT is completely the same. Even that optional science section, which ACT had threatened to maybe make more bulky and comprehensive in its actual coverage of science material, it's not the case at all, right? It's purely I think, don't want to be this glib about it, but it's a marketing move. They're wanting to make this assessment more desirable after College Board had so much success on the SAT, right? So when you are filling out your registration, folks, you're going to want to, as junior families, click that you want the paper test and you don't want to take the writing. If you are a sophomore family, rest assured colleges generally have said this new ACT is totally fine. We don't have as much information as we'd like on the science, but I'm saying go ahead and take it for the next couple of years until colleges say otherwise. And you can use the current classic ACT as a prep tool and resource until more and more practice resources and tests are available and published by ACT to use for preparation. Okay. So that was a lot. And we basically are almost out of, I think, the majority of time that I wanted to cover with you. Let's really quickly go over testing timelines and general guidance on submission. Is that okay, Lisa?
Yeah, I think those are topics that most parents want to hear about.
All right, awesome. So as I had said, most families choose to do this work in 11th and 12th grade because we want to see them see that students have benefited from their underlying coursework. Occasionally, we have heard, and it makes sense because if you've completed the first semester of Algebra 2, all of the math that appears on the SAT or ACT is in the rear view. You actually don't need any advanced trig, calculus, AP, anything to do extraordinarily well in the math sections. So some students are enrolled very early and maybe freshman or sophomore year in these classes and are ready to roll on the math side of things. The last thing you want, though, is an asymmetrical score where a student feels demoralized because they did far less well on the reading, because reading generally is, again, a cumulative skill that's developed. So 11th and 12th grade are generally when students do their best. 10th graders, I think it's totally fine to maybe choose which exam you ultimately want to take, but to not engage in any formal test prep until after your sophomore year is completed. Freshman families, if you're here right now, Godspeed. I'm sure I'll be giving a very different kind of presentation by the time you're up and at 'em. But it's much more important to just focus on your schoolwork and being a good human, all right? Here's generally what we say is best practice at Compass, our traditional timeline, is by the time we reach fall of 11th grade, we want to have made our choice, SAT or ACT, with the results of practice exams. Oftentimes, because the PSAT is offered in October of 11th grade, that's a great line in the sand. We compare that with a practice ACT, which any number of providers can provide as a complimentary service. We do it at Compass. You look at the results and see which test you like more, all right? You then sit for a first official exam sometime between February and May of your 11th grade year. And usually test prep occurs for, regardless of the underlying modality, about 8 to 10 weeks leading up to that targeted exam date. Right? You don't want to treat this like a sprint. Test prep is more about, I think, I don't want to say repetition because it's more than just rehearsal, but you are working on taking the content that you've developed in school and transcribing it onto a very alien testing format, with timing being an issue, feeling those heart palpitations in a standardized testing environment. And that can take a lot more time to sort of engineer than, just cramming before any traditional test that you might in an academic class, right? Note that if your student is in an AP curriculum or an IB curriculum, they may have to also study for those assessments as they're getting ready for a late spring SAT or ACT, right? The exams are offered year-round, including the summer, which has become a really popular time for many students to sit for a second SAT or ACT, and that's because you're free of the obligations of schoolwork. Fall of 12th grade, September or October is really your last opportunity to sit for an assessment. And that's because many colleges will have what are known as early action or early decision deadlines. They expect your testing portfolio to be complete if you are interested in applying using those deadlines, which demonstrate a greater amount of interest that you have in attending that school. Okay. Technically, there are opportunities later in the fall of 12th grade, but you might not be able to get that score in time for an application for some schools on your list, right? I'm just going to show you this very quick as an example. Compass offers complimentary practice tests, SATs and ACTs initially. And as I said, a number of different providers can get you this, but here's an example of, I think, what a really great score report will do for families who are trying to determine which test is best. So this is for a PSAT practice test that a student had with us. And we compared that with a prior ACT result that they took, all right? And we have built in something called a concordance, which is the way in which colleges make apples to apples comparisons amongst students who submit either SAT or ACT scores, like a translator, essentially. And this student's 1380 is clearly better than the 27 that they achieved. So we're saying they should favor the SAT. Though most students tend to perform about the same, as I mentioned earlier, and fall into what I would call the judgment call zone. We have the percentiles listed. We have examples of the different kinds of subcategories in reading and writing and math. And I would say the most important areas of the score report are the skill areas and question types that we review in exhaustive detail. So we're seeing specifically in the entire field of algebra or geometry or English standard conventions, whatever it is. We can figure out what it is that you need the most assistance with. We can be granular. You don't need to rehearse the entirety of these greater subject areas, all right? What we'll also do, and as these exams have gone online, we're able to more accurately check to see how much time students are spending on individual questions. So for example, this student on question number 6, we can even pull it up. We saw that they spent 6 minutes and 14 seconds, whereas most students who had gotten this question right on average spent 1 minute and 37 seconds. This disparity tells me that this student obviously spent far too much time, which likely came at the expense of having to rush at the end and miss items. So oftentimes what we're doing in test prep isn't necessarily being remediating or being entirely exhaustive in what material we're teaching students. We're working with that raw matter that they've developed in school. It's really about taking that and helping the student to take the test perfectly, ensuring that they're getting questions that will ultimately improve their score and are not falling for unforced errors, all right? So I'm going to end with one final little section about submitting or not submitting, and then we'll go into Q&A because I've seen there's a lot of that. I'm going to skip through here. All right. Taking official tests and submitting scores. So here is that Sally student character that I had mentioned earlier in tonight's presentation. Isn't she darling? She, with us, started with a 1220 on her September practice SAT. And because the family knew they were going to be able to invest in some private tutoring that was fairly targeted, the scores that she was shooting for were pretty lofty because she had schools like Georgetown, but also University of Maryland, Loyola Marymount University on the West Coast. 1450 would have satisfied all of those schools' mid-50th ranges, all right? We then, through the course of the program, had multiple practice tests. And if you were to do anything with regard to test preparation, a incrementally administered spine of practice tests that students take in order to build a level of automaticity. So they're not going in feeling scared or nervous. They can essentially be an autopilot, is an ideal. Okay, so you don't need to spend a ton of money. You can take these assessments for free, and College Board and ACT make these available to students. And you can see that over time, and this is both a factor of Sally getting prep with us, but even just exposure to the material over and over again, her practice test scores were gradually increasing. Her first official test was in May, where she scored a 1400, which was 50 points shy of where she wanted to be. And even though I was thrilled with this outcome, Mom and Sally were not. So I said, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because most colleges do something known as super scoring. This is the easiest way to improve your scores without having to invest in any test prep. All right, simply sit for the exam more than once. So she sat for a test in October as well. And most colleges for both the SAT and ACT will give you credit for the highest subscores across the administrations. So this new Franken score between the math of May and the verbal of October has the super score of a 1440 that would be at a school like UVA evaluated as the primary figure of the test score, all right? No singular test date, just the highest subscores across multiple dates. If you only have one test or no tests at all, you can't take advantage of super scoring. So most students tend to sit for 2 official exams, sometimes 3 with good reason, but any more than that, you start drifting into serial testing territory, right? Lastly, to submit or not to submit, I wish I had more clear guidance to give you. Unfortunately, colleges, as I've probably stated earlier, have individual preferences for these assessments, and some might find it to be more important in some cases than others. I've taken the submit or not submit, I guess, language from Grinnell because it very much resonates with my own beliefs. So they say, listen, if you got the score you hope for, and especially if it's above average, looking at their mid-50th ranges year over year, then by all means share. However, know that even if your score doesn't pass muster, it isn't in that range, it can still be something that's exceptional, because just as your grades are understood from the context from which you are emerging from, so are your test scores. So if you're at the 98th percentile among SAT takers at your school, and you're still 100 points below the average test score at Grinnell, they're saying, please share. We want to see that level of contextual strength. That's important. Lastly, they say a high SAT or ACT score can offset a low GPA, where even though I'm in the testing industry, I want to immediately backpedal this idea. It would be easy to pat myself on the back for this. The redemptive value of a test score is minor in comparison to the GPA, right? What you do day in and day out in school for 4 years should matter more than a few weekends of testing. A really great score, in the words of a dear friend of mine who works in admissions in the South, may heal the sick, but it will not revive the dead, right? It might polish off some of the hard edges of a transcript, a few classes or a semester, but by no means is it going to make up for many years of work. With Sally, she went ahead and submitted her 1440 to all the schools to which she was applying, including BC, which actually at its 25th percentile was a 1450. And again, Sally and Mom were very critical and doubtful of yours truly. But I said, trust me, especially in today's era of grade inflation, especially as colleges want to make sure that you do this work, that you're ready once you start, you're broadly proficient in math and verbal skills. They'll want to see this. And ultimately, that was where she ended up not only being accepted, but attending. And it was, I thought, a really great lesson as folks became so keenly and granularly focused on these ranges. They're not meant to be absolutes. So in conclusion, folks, I'll bring out Lisa in just another second. I just want to say that in my 17 years of doing this work, I have never had a family come back and say, oh, Matty, if only we had done more test prep, would our lives be radically different? Usually the inverse is true. They've overdone it. The student has been dragged kicking and screaming into some predatory form of test prep that was not right for them. And my favorite thing to mention at the ends of events like these is I was in Silicon Valley several years ago giving a presentation like this one. I had a very lawyery dad bum rush the stage, only to notice a little bit later that his daughter was horribly embarrassed standing behind him. And he said, Matty, you know, that presentation was great, but you have to understand that Megan and I, we're applying to Stanford, which was just down the street in Palo Alto. And we'll do whatever it takes. Every weekend, we'll clear our calendar. Money is no object. And yeah, I'm dismayed for multiple reasons, mostly the pronouns, because we are not doing this work. You know, of course, poor Megan is going to be trying to figure this out week after week. And let's say she does become the testing automaton of her father's dreams. All right. She gets a perfect score on the SAT or ACT, only to be embittered when she learns that at Stanford, something like 70% of students applying with perfect scores get rejected. It's kind of a sufficient, but, or I should say necessary, but insufficient element of the application that even among colleges that are super duper selective, a test score or even a perfect GPA isn't enough to really demonstrate what you're bringing as a human to the incoming freshman class. And they're often looking for all different sorts of qualitative elements in addition to the hard numbers of grades and testing. So if you can keep that in mind, parents, I have no doubt that you'll be a conduit of calm for your kiddos, and you will promptly forget about testing, you know, just as we all do eventually one day. So Lisa, thank you again for letting me go over, and I'm happy to discuss Q&A with you.
Great, Matty, thank you so much for that. That was incredibly helpful, and I hope all of you parents learned some new things from that. I certainly did, and I work with parents on this all the time, and I still learn plenty of new things. So thank you for that. We're going to try and do lightning round questions because so many of you have asked questions. I hope we'll get to as many as possible. You can always email us at grownandflown@gmail.com if we don't get to your question, and I can try and get you some answers that way. So Amy's question is, my daughter has a lot of test anxiety and is struggling to get a solid score. She's scoring significantly lower when she takes the real test than she did on the practice test. The question is two-part. One is, do you have thoughts about test anxiety? You must see this all the time. What do you suggest to students? And when do you stop pressing a kid? And should she do some prep over the summer? And when should parents stop pressing her to continue to do this because of the anxiety?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to, as a family, be discerning and sit around the dining room table and figure out, is this run-of-the-mill anxiety that we generally have when we're stressed about important things? Oftentimes, many students are not bad testers, but inexperienced testers. Um, my very worst exam, I would say actually I fall into the bad tester category in part because I had an undiagnosed anxiety disorder when I was younger. It was unmedicated, and all of that assumed its ultimate form when I sat for standardized tests. So I really, really empathize with folks that are experiencing that. But again, not to conflate that necessarily with just being unfamiliar and feeling a little bit uncomfortable with these basically designed to be uncomfortable assessments. So trying to figure that out is really important. Most students, and we try to be as fine-tuned as possible in our recommendations and when we provide examples of improvement. Um, every student will have a different baseline, and their improvement hinges often on that initial relative standing. So while you'll hear things like averages of test scores piped by, I don't know, like 200 points on the SAT if you put in a rigorous bout of test prep, whether that be private tutoring or classroom work or self-prep online, or 4 to 6 points of improvement on the ACT with similar efforts. That might not necessarily be the goal or even possible for a student who is scoring much lower or who is at the top of the funnel. All right. If you're already near perfect and trying to move the needle when the margin for error has like precipitously declined and you're seeing steeper deductions for making fewer mistakes, I'm not going to make that promise of you getting X number of points once you're at that level. Okay. So we do our best, and parents, students, I'm sure, as you're going through this process, you'll figure out, what is my soft ceiling? When am I basically best suited to cut my losses and focus on other elements of the application? So for that parent who had noted their student's test anxiety, this is where I would see, and I'd want to know, for how long have they been engaging in this exercise? What have practice tests looked like over time? How has the student responded to prep or taking practice tests in comparison to those official exams? And if it feels like this is just not necessarily going anywhere, you couldn't be in a better landscape for avoiding testing and focusing on the rest of your application. Okay. All is not lost. If that was the case, I scored, by the way, in the 15th percentile on the math and verbal sections of my GRE and was given a full ride to the University of Chicago. So I don't say that to boast, but I want to make sure that you all understand that there's hope out there. So that was a little bit rambly, but Lisa, thank
Terrific.
you for that.
Thanks, Maddie. Kids who are looking to study engineering,
Mm.
is there any reason they should take one test or another? Does that in any way affect their decision in terms of the ACT, the SAT? And you've already said to take the science section no matter what.
Yeah, so you're taking the science section on the ACT just as a precaution, not
Yeah.
even necessarily because STEM schools are saying that they want it, but there could be any number of schools that show some preference or some historical connection to science being part of the composite. Everyone on the block has known for decades at this point that science on the ACT is not the honest to goodness science that your students are used to seeing in their high school curricula. All right. What it really was created to do was satisfy standards in district and state contracts that were using the ACT as a high school exit requirement, right? It's why you're seeing generally comparable attitudes toward the SAT or ACT and ACT, in spite of there being this clear difference with a science section. I would say that on this like separate science element, how useful is it going to be in demonstrating your ability or rigor in a STEM focused college? Probably not very much. And I think if a college is serious about a student, what's going to be far more compelling is their math scores. That's what MIT, for example, said even a few years back. They were one of the first schools to return to requiring tests and said, we could almost do without, in some ways, like the reading and English components of these assessments, but to do the entry-level science and math coursework at MIT, we need to see that on the very broad math skills that are tested on these standardized tests that the student is prepared. Otherwise, they're in deep doo-doo. But I haven't seen like MIT or Carnegie Mellon or Caltech say, we need science. In fact, they've been pretty darn quiet about it.
Okay, terrific. Parents asking about, in some of the highly selective schools, do those small amounts of improvement really help? So the question here is like, if you move your math score from 790 to 80 in a very selective engineering school, will that matter? It's sort of a two-part question. And when colleges super score, do they look at those lower scores, or are those sort of just wiped from the equation? The ones that they're not actually using in the super score. If you really bomb dissection, doesn't matter.
Yeah, so I'll start with that second piece. A college that is honest about using super scoring is always going to give credit to students on those highest sections and understands if there's a significant underperformance on one day versus another. I wouldn't worry about that at all. Now the first question was about looking at
highly selective schools.
Yeah, so
making those small marginal differences.
Yeah, like maybe seeing the differences you were saying between like a 780, which is near perfect on the math or verbal of the SAT, or an 800, or even a 750 and an 800. And here's where I think the greatest ills and manipulation happen around standardized testing, in my opinion. So as I said, these tests are intentionally crude. And students generally, when they take multiple exams, just as we've seen with super scoring, have a range of potential scores that they'll hit across multiple test dates. These exams are not as reliable as we'd like them to be, where students are consistently hitting the exact same score over and over and over. And colleges should understand this. And any school, and they still exist out there, and I won't name names because that is unprofessional, but there are folks who will make claims and high school auditoriums. They'll be representing their highly selective university, and they'll say 32 and above on the ACT and 1400 and above on the SAT. Anything below that, don't submit. And I think that is lazy. I think that is trying to use a very blunt tool to make a very delicate decision about admissions. And it's maybe a efficient way of trying to weed through an applicant pool, but it doesn't honor the fact that students, again, score within a range. So if you happen to hear about a school that gives a damn about you being either a 780 or an 800 or 750 or an 800, I mean, I immediately start looking internally at my values as an individual, and is this going to be the thing that really keeps my student out? And what does that say about the kind of education they're going to get there? So, yeah, sorry, I went on a little bit of a tirade there.
No problem. I just want to tell everybody, we can go a couple minutes over. We were going to end at 9. We can go a couple minutes over if you want to stay with us. Submitting or not submitting the scores making a difference for merit money? Have I gone outside of you? I know you're not a financial aid specialist.
No. Yeah, I'm right with you. So broadly, as you look at more and more selective colleges, you'll see there is like an inverse relationship with the amount of merit aid that is offered. That usually the greatest amount of merit aid when it comes to standardized testing is offered by specific state scholarships. For example, I know in the state of Florida, if you get a particular SAT or ACT result and a particular GPA, you immediately qualify for the Bright Futures Scholarship, which can cover a significant chunk of your undergraduate education. Same thing in Tennessee with the Hope Scholarship, or in Georgia. So it's always a good idea, especially if you're applying to in-state schools, to see what folks are saying at your universities, at public universities, and whether or not testing is used within these academic indexes to offer out aid. I didn't get to talk about the PSAT much today, but you probably have heard of something called the National Merit Scholarship Corporation. And I just want to throw out there that most schools across the country will offer the PSAT in October of 11th grade. And if you happen to score within the top 1% of your state, all right, your student may go on to qualify as a finalist or scholar. And at this point, the money that you get from the National Merit Scholarship Corporation isn't as much as we would think. Massive tuition remission and awards that were offered to students just because of test scores don't really exist in the same way now. So for national merit, on average, we're seeing like $3,000 to $5,000 for the grand array of your college education. So if you're trying to spend a bunch of money on test prep to, in a Herculean way, raise your academic base to get that, it might not be worth your energy and effort. So I would say, again, start with your state schools, see what money is available there for test scores, and then look at the various colleges on your list and look more closely. They often will advertise specific scholarships from either donors or alumni or whatever written in their names that go out to students who satisfy criteria XYZ.
Terrific. Someone's asking whether there are different versions of the test given in different parts of the country. They've heard that rural parts of the country tend to take a different test than some of the competitive city tests. Is there any validity to this?
No, unfortunately, or no, fortunately, is what I should say. So, what do I want to start with first? So, oftentimes when the folks at College Board and ACT make an exam, they're trying to ensure that it performs consistently and has the same chemistry of easy, medium, and hard questions, and is recreating that distribution. Occasionally, it doesn't go as they planned, and maybe they designed a test that was a little bit too easy, meaning that more students got questions right than they expected, or maybe a little bit too hard, where students missed more questions than they had anticipated when they were building that test form. But there's something known as equating that they do afterward to ensure that students aren't penalized based on a test form that was easier or harder. And that ultimately, like we almost think about a curve being made in school, there is an equating process that ensures that no one is getting a bad deal because of some issues in test design. With regard to the SAT now, College Board's digital adaptive test, I want to point out that instead of there being a discrete exam that every student is offered, you're actually taking a test that is pulling somewhat randomly of a bank of tens of thousands of questions in the cloud. And they are organized generally by difficulty, and they need to satisfy a particular quota of easy, medium, and hard questions. But the actual questions themselves could differ from student to student. All right. So in a way, it was mostly done to eliminate cheating. So students couldn't look over at other screens or Scantrons or something. But yeah, to answer that question, no, there is no easier or harder test. There is no difference regionally in how a test is meant to perform. That's not possible.
Okay. Somebody's asking, how do you apply for accommodations of a time and a half when a child is homeschooled?
Okay, this is so I will throw out there, and maybe also Lisa, I'll include a link to this. I'm sort of our accommodations guru at Compass.
Okay.
And I have a post that I've written about the parallel processes of applying for accommodations for College Board and ACT.
Can you give me that and let me include that in the email to everyone, because we have a couple of accommodation questions and I feel like that's a subject that deserves more than 3 minutes and needs to go into. Okay, perfect. So I will send that out. If anyone's watching, we will send that out and you will get more detail than we can do, as we're quickly approaching the the time that we've got. How do you know if your kid needs coaching? We didn't really touch on that.
Yeah.
I know it's a
So
broad question.
yeah. Again, I think I try to separate out the pros and cons of different forms of preparation for these exams. And I think fundamentally what you're trying to build, regardless of that modality, is a level of understanding of the broad content that is tested on these exams, the somewhat helpful but often overblown strategies that you might want to use, like process of elimination, things that might not necessarily come as easily because it's not something you would use during your tests in school. That might be active note taking and ensuring that passages are covered in helpful notes so that you're able to comprehend what you're reading better. Then I would say that actually the two elements that require the greatest amount of attention are emotional control and time management. So there's usually someone who falls within the spectrum of being super anxious about taking these tests, and we have to channel that anxiety into calm. Or on the other end, students who are bored to tears, especially if they're really strong mathematicians, who need to channel that boredom into focus. And regardless of how a student performs, unless I guess they're already near perfect without any formal prep, I think that there can be help in all cases for students who want to do private work. I will say that private tutoring, although it's incredibly efficient, precise, and laser focused, it comes with a hefty price tag, regardless of who you might be working with. Classroom instruction can be really great, especially for students that prefer to learn in a more social dynamic. And I would say it's most effective for students who are middle of the road, who don't mind being taught in a much broader and less specific way for these assessments, all right? Self-prep is wonderful and can be just as effective as the other two modalities, but just requires a level of self-discipline that very few students have and can exercise consistently. But there are online resources. Khan Academy, for example, has an adaptive platform that creates customized syllabi that students can use to prep for the SAT, which I think is really great. If you need any assistance determining whether or not prep is really going to be that effective, I will just throw out a pitch. If you liked what I said, this is the one hat in hand pitch. If you liked what I said and you want to speak with someone like me at Compass about this, we will provide you with very earnest and candid thoughts about what points are really in the tank, what to invest, and you can take that to Johnny Tutor down the street if you want. You don't need to work with us. But I think a lot of folks out there will be more than happy to fan those flames of insecurity about testing and make it into a far larger deal than it needs to be.
A couple of parents are asking, you mentioned practice tests. How would they find out about that? How does one do practice tests?
Yeah. So Compass offers initial SAT and ACT practice tests, and it's a complimentary thing. And actually, I'll also include a link about that in the follow-up message. And what we do for the vast majority of students across the country, unless they live within like throwing distance to one of our offices, which we're based in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, Houston, DC, close to where I am. But if you're not in one of those areas, one of the most popular ways that students take these exams is just online from the comfort of their own homes with a video with timing standards that we create for students who take the exam with regular or extended time. So upon completion of the assessment, they're given that really robust score report that I demoed for you. It happens instantaneously. And you have that. You don't necessarily need to find out more about prep or talk to someone else. We can offer that to you free of charge.
A couple of parents are saying that their kids took geometry in 10th grade and algebra in 11th grade. Do they need to wait to take the SAT until after the end of their junior year?
Probably not. What I would recommend is that as a litmus test, you have your students sit for, again, practice versions of the exam and see what math looks like. I wouldn't be surprised if they've seen the bulk of the math that they'll already need to do well on these assessments, even if the curriculum is a little bit different from how the test is usually aligned.
Okay. In continuing on our lightning round,
Yeah.
a couple of parents have said that the kids sent scores. You know how you can send some free scores in when you take the test, and then they didn't like the score they got on the test. Can you ask schools to ignore that if the schools are test optional?
Oh, goodness. So, this is where I think we get a little bit into issues of access and strategy and how they don't often align with each other. So for those families that have to deal with the administrative charge of submitting your scores to a particular school, and last I remember, it's something like $30 to $40 if you're sending your testing transcript to a particular school, unless they're part of a larger consortium like the Common App, which will allow you to submit your scores simultaneously to a bunch of schools. Also, there is a growing cadre of colleges that allow for something called self-reporting, which is you just tell them, sorry.
Would you explain this to parents, because I don't think they know about the self-reporting?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
then
happy to
perhaps
explain it.
that's why they're doing sending
Yeah.
these scores in.
So many colleges, and we have a list of these schools also on our website that will, prior to you accepting your offer of admission, you just have to formally confirm the score that you shared with them, just informally on the application. You just wrote it out. You knew maybe they just want to know your highest composite or total score on a single date. Or maybe they wanted you to report your highest subscore so that you essentially super score for them. And later, they just have you submit an official testing transcript from College Board or ACT to validate that that is indeed what you got. So you only have to spend, money then. So the thing that was mentioned earlier is that College Board and ACT offer a number of free score sends to a handful of colleges when you are sitting for the official test. And while this can be really helpful for families that don't necessarily want to deal with paying for multiple submissions, I think it isn't in the best interest strategically, because you might not want to share a particular test sitting with the school. And the truth of the matter is, even though colleges might state a preference for wanting to see every score from every test you've ever taken, you own those scores. College Board and ACT will never share that information unless you release it to colleges. So oftentimes, it's really only in the case where we have some serial testers that have sat for these assessments like 8 or 9 times. And I'm like, what are you doing? Where families are really nervous afterward, being like, oh crap, they're going to see that we took this test so many times. And I say, hold your, slow your roll. It's totally fine. Just share the test dates that you want. You'll pay the administrative fee for that, and you'll be done with it. And I'm looking at, by the way, I see Louise, you said in California, Compass practice tests are $50, and that's for generally in-person and online tests. But for all of our grown and flown folks, I'll be including a redemption code, so that way you can waive those initial practice test fees. So I wanted to make sure that that was made very clear.
Terrific. I think we need to end there. We didn't get through everyone's questions, but I was thrilled that you were able to answer so many. And the comments, as you can see, parents found this incredibly useful. Hopefully tomorrow, if I do everything right, you will all get an email with the recording and the many links to the things that Matty mentioned here tonight. And if you need to contact me about any of this, I know how to contact Matty. You know how to contact Matty. His email's right there.
Yep.
And I'm just at grownandflown@gmail.com. So thank you, everybody, for your time. And I hope this was incredibly useful for your students. And Matty, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Best of luck, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Okay, bye-bye.